Olá a todos, eu sou o Lucas Buffalo e bem-vindos a mais um Pode Ser. E hoje a gente está aqui com o Raphael Rowe, jornalista investigativo, escritor e apresentador de televisão britânico, que passou 12 anos preso por um crime que ele nunca cometeu. Ele está aqui conosco hoje para nos contar tudo o que ele passou. Mr. Rowe, thank you so much for being here with us. It's more than a pleasure to interview you. Congratulations for all your work in your podcast and your books on Netflix. Seriously, great job, and it's wonderful to interview you. So, before we start with the questions, Mr. Rowe, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your biography? Tell us, who is Raphael Rowe?
That's a really good but simple question. Thank you so much for inviting me on to your podcast, and I hope that your listeners enjoy this interview, because I'm aware that people in Brazil who will be listening to this podcast will be familiar with my work, may be familiar with who I am. And you asked the question, who am I? I am a man who spent many years of his younger years, life, in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Before that, I was like any other young man growing up in inner city London, facing the challenges that you face as a young man when you come from a semi-deprived, if not deprived, disadvantaged community, very much like people experience in Brazil and across the globe, I suppose. But my trajectory ended up with me being wrongfully arrested, charged and imprisoned for life for a murder and a series of robberies that I didn't commit. I then spent all of my 20s in prison and beyond, fighting against that wrongful imprisonment and charges, where eventually my convictions were overturned. I was released. I then went on to become a senior journalist for the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, where I strutted my stuff as an investigative journalist, if you like, on some of the most prestigious BBC platforms, including radio and television, and went on to become the presenter and the host of a very critically acclaimed Netflix series for the streamer Netflix called Inside the World's Toughest Prisons. So even though my journey started off being in prison for a crime I didn't commit, I then went on to willingly go inside prisons to educate people about the balance between how you rehabilitate people, punish them, security. So in a nutshell, the moral of my story is that even through trials and tribulations, even through biggest challenges, even through those traumas, you can shape the person that you become. And that's definitely the person I've become. I've used my trauma to shape the journalist I become and the purpose that I serve.
Well, congratulations for all this work you've done. It's truly an epic journey. All these trials and tribulations you've been through, like you've been wrongfully convicted, and now you're like a superstar, a journalist on Netflix. So really congratulations for all this work that you've done. And getting more into detail, Mr. Rowe, tell us what happened in 1988, and how did, with the M25, and how did that get to you? How did you get wrongfully convicted? Tell us what exactly happened in 1988.
I wish I had enough time to tell you the nitty-gritty details, but in essence, what we're talking about is three young black men, or men of color, brown and black, ended up being arrested for crimes that the victims described had been committed by two white men and one black man. And I say that early on because it's really important for people to recognize that what happened to me was an injustice of a magnitude that sometimes can be unbelievable. And why do I say that? Because how can three men of color, and at the time I had dreadlocks, so my appearance was very different. My co-defendant, one of my co-defendants, who is also a black man, had dreadlocks, and the third co-defendant was also a black man. Yet the victims of the crimes, i.e. the robberies for which the M25 three were known or accused of committing, were described as being perpetrated by the victims, who are the most important element of this story, as being two white men and one black man, including the survivor at the scene of where the murder took place. In fact, the detail, when you ask the question, how did this happen? The detail from that survivor was that he saw the skin through the balaclava of one of the robbers, and it was white. And the reason that is so important is because even the victims at the second scene, where a robbery and an attempted murder took place, the victims described two white men and one black man. So two separate scenes. The victims have described the perpetrators of these crimes as consisting of two white men and one black man. But one of the victims went further and described blue eyes and described fair hair. So these are detailed descriptions from the victims. And I recognize, and everybody should recognize that at a point of being attacked and almost murdered and robbed, that people can be frightened and they can make mistakes, right? That's what happens in criminal cases. And we know that evidence can be undermined as a result. But these are detailed descriptions. Blue eyes, you don't see black eyes and describe blue eyes, right? You see blue eyes and you describe blue eyes. And so those were the details that were presented by my defense at my trial alongside my co-defendant's defense team, and yet we were still convicted. The jury ignored that evidence. The prosecution played down that evidence. And so I was destined to spend the rest of my life inside prison for crimes I didn't commit, when everybody in that courtroom must have been questioning how the police charged three black men and stood in the dock when the victims of the crimes were describing two white and one black. And people will answer the question, well, why didn't the victims stand up and give that kind of evidence? Well, they did, and they were ignored. So the victims of the crimes for which I was imprisoned described the perpetrators, and they were ignored. They didn't stand up and make a lot of noise about it. So that's just one element. There was no forensic evidence in my case because I was not at the scene. So there was no forensic evidence linking me or my co-defendants with the crimes. There was forensic evidence in the case, but it was linking a white man with blue eyes and fair hair to the case, but he wasn't charged. He became a key prosecution witness in which he received a substantial amount of money from the police as a reward from the reward money that was put up in this case, because the national newspapers and the victims' families put up a reward before anyone had been arrested, asking for the capture or information that would lead to the prosecution and conviction. And this individual received, as far as we are aware, a substantial amount of that reward money. So these are some of the details I'm sharing with you when you ask the question, how could this substantial miscarriage of justice have taken place? People were paid money. There was a conspiracy between the police and some of the witnesses to give false evidence. The identification evidence from the victims was ignored, and our alibis were ignored. And I'll share this with you because it's really important. At the very moment that the person in my case was losing their life, at the very moment this person was dying, was being killed, however you want to describe it, I had a witness who said I was in bed with her making love at that very moment, at least 30 miles away from where the crime was taking place.
It was literally impossible.
It was literally impossible. And it's really good you make that point, because what did the judge? You called it literally impossible. The judge, in my case, called it a mystery. It's a mystery that the jury have to reconcile. Was I in bed with this girl who had no reason to say I wasn't because she was a prosecution witness, or was I at the scene of a crime 30 miles away? They decided I was at the crime 30 miles away and ignored her evidence.
Mr. Rowe, after you were wrongfully convicted and you went to the prison system, how was your life inside the jail cell, in the prison system, with other inmates? Like, how did you conduct your life, like in that reality?
I suppose my existence was very different from the guilty man, okay? When a person has committed a crime and they go to prison, they have to accept accountability, responsibility. They are treated very differently from a person like myself who was protesting their innocence. Although the authorities, the prison guards, the screws, the prison officers, and other prisoners deemed me to be as guilty as them because they didn't really know, I wasn't guilty. And so I wouldn't conform to the regime. I wouldn't accept accountability because I was innocent. And therefore, I resisted the regime. And what that meant was that I was punished as a consequence. And I'll give you an example. If I was required to go to a workshop in the prison as part of the mandatory punishment of being in prison, I'd refuse. As a consequence, I'd be taken to isolation or segregation, and I'd suffer physical consequences on occasions because I would resist that. And at that time, I was 20 years old. I was 21, I was 22, I was 23. So I was young, bitter, twisted, and volatile. And so I was challenging the authority that had wrongfully imprisoned me, the authority that are supposed to reassure us, the public and people, that they do the right thing and lock up the right people. But in my case, they got it wrong. And I was being punished, not only being in prison for a crime I didn't commit, but continuously punished while I was in prison. And it took a number of years of physical beatings, isolation, segregation, mental stress, physical stress before the media, who had described me as a monster, the media who had described me as a murderer, the media who had said I was the leader of a particular gang who committed these horrible crimes. It took a number of years for me to change the narrative around what and how that media were describing me, because the more I got out to them information about my wrongful imprisonment, like the white men, the blue eyes, like the no forensic evidence, where more and more people started to question the reliability of the evidence, the narrative changed. But it only changed because I, whilst I was in prison, studied the law, understood, not officially, didn't do a degree or anything. I self-taught myself how the law works so that I could better defend myself. I also embarked on a journalism course, a correspondence course, to try and manipulate how the media told stories about me as an individual. So as I say, where they were calling me a monster, a murderer, I learned how the media worked so that I could manipulate the stories they wrote about me. So they started writing stories that called me potentially innocent, a miscarriage of justice, a victim of a miscarriage of justice. So I got rid of that tag of being a monster and a murderer, where people were now questioning the safety of my conviction, the wrongful imprisonment. And that narrative was really important, really important. So when that started to happen, the prisoners and the prison staff were not taking my word for it anymore, that I was innocent and I shouldn't be in prison. They were now reading it from respectable journalists and broadcasters like the BBC, who started to make documentaries about my case, raising questions about the evidence, interviewing witnesses, etc., that were also questioning. So a lot of that did come down to the minute physical beatings, the isolation and the segregation that I had to go through, the suffering that I had to go through, my extended family had to go through, my campaigners and people that believed in me had to go through in order to get to where we needed to get to, which was eventually my convictions being overturned and me being freed.
And Mr. Rowe, after you were freed from the prison system, how was your life rehabilitating into society? How was your life like in society after you were released?
Yeah, and I think that's something that people tend to think is the euphoria, right? You think conviction quashed, I walk out. I went in when I was 20. I came out when I was 32 years old. So I missed every day of my 20s confined to a prison cell where I was held on my own. I was not in a cell with anybody else. I didn't have a television. I didn't have a toilet for, I'd say, 11 of those 12 years. I used to pee and poo in a potty. I didn't have a handle on the inside of my door. I didn't have the ability to make decisions for myself for 12 years. When I wanted to have a pee and a poo, it was in a potty that was under my bed, that was bolted to the floor in a room that was 6x9 with bars that were crisscrossed, and I could hardly get any light in there for all of those years. And when I did pee and poo in my potty and it was full up, I had to wait until a prison officer opened the door and allowed me to go and empty it in a urine where everybody else was emptying theirs. And that inhumane treatment shaped the person that I become when my conviction was overturned and I was released. So you asked the question, what was it like when I got out? Yes, in the first 24, 48 hours, there was popping of champagne and there were celebrations. But then everybody in my life, including my sisters and my family, had to get on with bringing up their kids and working and earning money. And I found myself on my own, as you would. And the excitement and the euphoria disappears. And then you've got to get on with life. And what that meant for me and what it means for people, whether they are guilty or not guilty, coming out of prison after a long time, is you lose the ability to do things that you have grown up to do naturally. And here's an example. I'd lost the ability because of my wrongful imprisonment and the years that I spent in a cell where there was no handle on the inside of a door. I'd lost the ability to open a door for myself for a short period after I got out of prison, because I would walk up to a door and I'd stop and wait for someone to open it for me, even though there was a handle on the inside this time, because I was free and I could reach for that handle and I could open that door for myself. But I'd lost the instinct to do that because every time I walked through a door in a prison, it was opened and closed for me. So the conditioning that you go through during the years that you are held in prison can affect your ability to do things naturally in the open, free world. And I would just stress that, you've got to multiply that by a number of other things. I couldn't sleep in a bed with a partner because I'd been sleeping in a single bed by myself for 12 years. And I know people do that naturally, but when you're in prison, you cuddle the wall, right? You find comfort in the stone cold wall that is next to your cell bed. All of a sudden you find yourself out in the wide world, and there is an abundance of opportunity to sleep with other people, but it was uncomfortable and I couldn't do that. And, so I'm just trying to stress that, for people who go to prison, who are treated inhumanely, who are treated like animals and deprived of things that they should be entitled to, even though they're in prison, or just the simple being in prison, rightfully or wrongly, but rightfully, there are consequences to the psychological, physical existence of a person when they're released. And those are just some of the examples of the challenges that I faced, whilst I was in prison and came out of prison.
Yeah, some psychological cues, some psychological patterns, they stay with us, right? Especially after 12 years, right, Mr. Rowe?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think about that in any world, whether it's in the military, and I suppose the same applies to people who are working for an institution, right? You leave that job and you've learned a skill, and now you've got to acquire new skills to do a new job if you've been made redundant or something. It's like what you and I do in terms of interviewing people. There is a skill to getting the best out of people where you listen to what they have to say and you listen to their story rather than it being about you. There is a skill in everything that we do, and relearning abilities, but there is a positive, right? And that's why I said at the beginning of this, my traumas I've turned into the positives. All of that experience has made me the person that I am today in terms of my values, my morals, my compass, my dogged approach, my compassion. All of my experiences have been put to good use.
And Mr. Rowe, how was the process of pursuing a degree in journalism inside prison, in jail? How was that process? And how did you bring that when you were released? How did you bring that that degree to use with the BBC and everything? How was your trajectory in journalism?
Well, I should say this: I didn't get a degree in journalism. So the process was this: whilst I was in prison, whilst I mentioned earlier on that what was important for me was to change the narrative of the story that was being told about who I was and the crimes that I didn't commit. So I was able to approach through the education department within the British prison system an opportunity whereby a university college in the UK would provide me with booklets where there were courses on how to study to become a journalist. And I received these booklets in my prison cell, and I would read those booklets, and I would do what anybody would do in college. I would embark on, as much as I could, answering those questions and developing my understanding of what journalism is all about. And then I would maybe go and try and interview somebody to learn about how to write up that interview. And then I would send that to the college on the outside and they would mark it and they would send it back in. It was that very slow, snail process. You know, digital technology did not exist in prison. Mobile phones didn't exist in prison. So it was always done by the power of the pen and ink and good old postage. You post it and it go in and it come back. And I never got to finish that course because I was such a bad person in prison. I was so volatile and violent in my behavior that I was often, and because of my security status, I was considered a high-risk prisoner. So I was often moved from one establishment and to another establishment, or I'd be moved out of my cell to another cell and all my papers and things would be left behind. So I never really actually got to finish the journalism course, although I did learn a lot. And from the confines of my prison cell, I did write to newspapers who published my letters where I questioned not just my wrongful conviction, but issues to do with the law, whether it was disclosure of evidence and legalities. And when I came out of prison, I had no desire, and this is honest, I had no desire to become a journalist. I did it purely to manipulate the journalist to tell proper stories and true stories about myself. But I found myself in an opportunity that I couldn't turn down, where somebody who was aware of the high profileness of my case, who I met at the BBC, who offered me a job. I didn't apply for the job. I didn't submit an application. I didn't do any interviews. I just met somebody who liked me, liked what I had to say, but recognized that I had a skill that the academic journalists didn't have, right? Because the academic journalists go to university and they learn how to become a journalist from the books. They may get a little bit of experience, more so today than in the past. I had the ability to talk to people, to interact with people. I had the skills of investigating because I had to investigate my own case. And I was a meticulous, and this is really important, I was a meticulous researcher. So it meant researching my own case in prison for 12 years was a good skill to have to research something on the outside, whether it was an injustice or it was a story. I just had that skill. And the other thing was, what I was doing complemented the academic journey. So I would describe myself as a street journalist. I learned my trade on the street. I'd climb over the wall and get the evidence where they'd knock on the door and go through the door. So there was a difference in our skills, right? I could deal with criminals because I lived in that world. I could deal with politicians because I competed with that world, you know. And so my academic colleague had the skills that they acquired and I had my skills. So we complemented each other. And that just helped my career. That just helped my career, whether I was to become a radio journalist, which I started out as, whether it was in front of the camera, whether it was writing the script. But it all came down to, I think, the final thing, which was about integrity and honesty and about, you know, presenting something that was as honest as I could possibly make it. And that's how I developed my career as a journalist at the very beginning.
Yeah, you were there doing the field work. You were doing the actual practice. Because one thing is being at university. The other thing is being there in the reality like you were, right, Mr. Rowe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I brought that into my world, as I say. You know, I one of the very first stories I did was to go to Afghanistan. And it was not long after the British and the Americans had been in to close down the Taliban. I didn't go out there to report on the war. I went out there to report on the heroin trade and how heroin is moving from Afghanistan into the United Kingdom. And so I followed it, you know, so I went to Afghanistan, I met the warlords who grow the poppies and sell it to the drug traffickers. And then I followed the drugs into Turkey, the route into the UK. And then I followed the drugs from Turkey into the UK, into the little rat that is sold to the girl on the street that puts it in her arm. So that's what I was doing. I was looking at the minute detail and breaking it down and taking huge risks that other journalists might not be willing or prepared to take, or even have the skill, because when you're sitting down with somebody who's drug dealing, trafficking, you've got to have a sense about you that is, I wouldn't say fearless, because I am, like anybody else, scared of things, as I should be. but I was so fresh and so naive and so willing. I was smuggling. One of the other stories I did is I went to Sierra Leone in Western Africa, and I bought conflict diamonds as an undercover journalist. I spent a lot of my early career as a journalist undercover. So I bought diamonds pretending to be a diamond dealer. I smuggled those diamonds myself from Sierra Leone to the United Kingdom. If I would have been caught by the authorities, who knows what would have happened. I was working for the BBC at the time, so you'd like to think that if I was caught, the BBC lawyers and legal team would have protected me, because it was in the interest of journalism, in the interest of exposing the trade in conflict diamonds. But yeah, so those were the sorts of things that I was doing, because I was bold, brave, and I was this new type of journalist that the BBC were not used to. And I still had my dreadlocks at the time. So I was very different, and I could get away with it because in prison, I'd met those kinds of guys. I knew how they talked, how they behaved, how they thought, because I lived amongst them. But I was also brave enough to know that there is danger and there is not danger. And you will know, and I'm sure some of your audience will know, that I've been into a Brazilian prison where there has been extreme violence taking place. And why did those guys welcome me? As a journalist, people that sometimes they don't respect, it's because I saw them on an eye-to-eye level, because I didn't go in there judging them. It's because I went in there and gave them an opportunity to share their story. Rightly or wrongly, people might not agree that perpetrators of crimes should be allowed. I just treated them as human beings and tried to understand, to educate the wider audience. I didn't judge them for the crimes they committed or went on to commit, and the things that they did, even though some of it was barbaric and some of it is seen to be extremely violent across the globe. When people watch that particular episode out of Portobello and the history of some of the violence between different gangs in Brazilian prisons. But for me, those guys welcomed me. There was a scene, and I don't know if you know this, if you haven't seen the episode, you should, because there was a scene in that particular film, and it was my very first episode for Netflix. The very first prison I went in for my Netflix show was in Portobello, and it was in the Brazilian prison. And there was a scene where I was in the porter cabin, or the pavilion, with all these guys who had been involved in some barbaric acts of violence since they'd been in prison, the beheading of other prisons, etc. And I met with these guys and they welcomed me. They were a bit hesitant, but they welcomed me. And there was a moment in that film where they learned that I myself had been to prison. They learned that I had been in prison for a crime I hadn't committed. And they asked a very simple, naive question to me, which was, how and why didn't you take your own life if you were in prison? Did you ever think about killing yourself? And I said, no. Why would I think about killing myself? What I needed to do was to fight to win my freedom back. And at that moment, I got this kind of rush of brotherhood, if you like, from these guys. That it was as if they welcomed me into their world, and their world of trust, where they would now open up and share with me their own personal stories. And I think that's really important, because we identified with each other. And I should stress this is not me saying that the public should have sympathy for people that are in prison for the wicked things that they've done and the crimes. But they should also recognize that if we treat people in an inhumane way, that they will become inhumane and they will react to that. So it's better we get people to be rehabilitated than to turn them into the animals that could go on to cause future crimes and victims.
Ending the cycle of violence, right, Mr. Rowe? Just ending this continuous cycle, right?
But that's impossible. You can't do that. But what you can do is you can attempt to change one person at a time. And every time you make that practical and possible, you stop the next victim, right? You stop that person from inflicting, but you can't do it to everyone. And that's not to say that we should never stop trying, right? We should always try. Why shouldn't we?
And focusing with your experience in Portobello, Mr. Rowe, how do you compare the Brazilian prison system with the rest of the world? And with your experience, like, what was the difference that you saw in Brazil compared to the rest of the world? And like, how long were you there?
So I was in the prison for about 7 days, and that is living with the prisoners for 6 days and 1 day with the staff. The honest opinion is I was shocked. I was really shocked by the conditions that the prisoners are being held in. I was really shocked by the relationship between the prisoners and the prison staff. And I'll give you an example. The prisoners, when they are being in this particular prison, when the prisoners were being let out of their cells by the guards, it was at gunpoint. And the prisoners were not allowed to leave their pavilion until the guards had retreated from the pavilion by up to 10 meters, I think it was. So I was witnessing the guards unlocking all of these pavilions for, the morning's outbreak and backing off at shotgun point to 10 meters before the prisoners slowly started to come out of their pavilions. And that was a real eye-opener and a real surprise to me, because that is not the same that I've seen before or since I've been to Portobello and Brazil. So the relationship between the staff and the prisoners was a real concern to me, because that just means that very little is being done. But the conditions, the prisoners complained about food, but that's global. Prisoners complain about food all over the world. Although they laughed at me because I was prepared to eat something that even one of the little puppy dogs they had in the prison wouldn't be prepared to eat, which was quite a surreal moment. But there was also other things that were kind of inspiring. I remember speaking to one prisoner about the fact that in Brazil, prisoners are entitled to conjugal visits, i.e. they can have a relationship with their partner and have private rooms to continue that relationship. You don't have that here in the United Kingdom. You don't have that in various other European prisons. It is in other places around the world. In South America in particular, you have it, but in Europe, it's very rare to be allowed to have conjugal visits. And when I asked one of the prisoners, well, in a British prison, you would have a sink, you would have a toilet now, because that's what they've done since I left the prison. They built, utensils in the prison. You have facilities that are far better than what you get here. And the guy said to me, why would I give up having a relationship with my wife for a toilet? And it makes sense, right? You can have both. You can have a toilet and you can have a mattress and see your partner. But in terms of the resources in this particular prison, it didn't lead to any real rehabilitation programs. And the other thing that really, really disappointed me and really made me think hard about what more could be done was listening to a number of very young men who were in prison, who had been indoctrinated by the gang culture. And they had this attitude that you either live or you die by the gang culture, because they didn't think differently. No one was in there telling them, from what I could see, that there is more to life than being affiliated to a gang who couldn't care less about you once you're no longer a part of that gang and you're in prison and stuff. I just felt that there was an opportunity within these environments to educate these young men, but it wasn't taking place. And I just wish that I could and others could do more to take those young men and tell them that they've got their whole lives ahead of them. And if only they thought differently, they'd behave differently, and their lives would change. But not just their lives, the future victims that are going to suffer as a consequence of their mentality at the moment.
Yeah, they have their whole life ahead of them, right, Mr. Rowe? And they end up finding a sense of belonging with certain gangs, right? When they're in that system, right?
Yeah, and it's a false sense of security, isn't it? Because it's not, it's just half of them being used, and they'll either end up like I met them in prison, dead, drug addicts, so there is no future. It might be the future they want, and that's difficult. You can't force them, but you can try and change their mindset. And don't get me wrong, I met a number of people in position of authority whilst I was making that Netflix show in that Brazilian prison, and in another prison that I visited, one of the maximum security ones, who are trying to do things, or at least saying that they're trying to do things. And there are individuals who are trying to work with these individuals, but it can be really challenging when they don't have the right resources to do that, whether it's the financial resources or the manpower to try and make that difference, which is why the film that I made was so important, because it opened an international audience's eyes to not just the challenge that the Brazilian authorities have, but it's just indicative of the challenges that the criminal justice and prisons have around the globe. But there were some positive things. I took part in an Amazon therapy session with a bunch of guys where we covered our bodies in this mud, and there was this ritual where they all kind of celebrated their similarities as opposed to their differences, like the gang members do, and that was really, really warming. And I just wish there was more of that around the world. So there are a lot of positives that I took out of that episode in Brazil that other prisons or authorities around the world could learn from.
And inside all of the world's toughest prisons, Mr. Rowe, what would you say was the toughest of all of them?
I wish I got £1 for every time someone asked me that question. I'd be a multi-millionaire. I think if I'm going to be honest, I will say that when I first walked into the Brazilian prison and I was aware of some of the crimes that the prisoners had committed since they'd been in prison, let alone the crimes they committed that got them sent to prison. But, I'd seen videos of the riots that had taken place inside the Brazilian prisons. I'd seen the crimes that had been committed by the prisoners who was in the prison that I was going to. And then I'm in that prison meeting some of those guys who had committed those crimes. And we're talking about acts of real barbarity, people kicking their heads that had been severed from other people's bodies as footballs and laughing about it. And that kind of depravity was a real shock to me. I'd never seen anything like it. And here I was meeting guys that had witnessed those acts of violence, of murder, of depravity. And so for me, it was on different levels one of the toughest that I've been in, because there were those who didn't participate in these activities but would have to live with these memories of what they witnessed and what they saw. There were those who had been victims of the riots and the clashes within this Portobello prison who carried the scars, and I mean physical scars, where they survived attempted murders on their lives, simply because they were of a different faction to the ones that had been involved in the riot. So Brazil, if I'm honest, was one of the toughest for those reasons. But I would also argue that one of the most humane prisons that I went to was in Norway, where the facilities and the conditions and the treatment of prisoners is, like some people say, being a student in a university. In fact, people often say that the cells in the Scandinavian prisons are better than my student accommodation. But what they fail to remember is that those cells don't have handles on the inside. Prisoners cannot walk out of those doors when they want. So you can give them a PlayStation or a television. You can give them all the things that make life inside a cell more comfortable, but it's the psychological damage that prison has on an individual that makes it the toughest prison. Not the structure, not the facilities, but the psychological. So in my experience, having visited so many different prisons around the globe, in this series, what I've learned is that the psychological damage that prison does to an individual is tougher than the confinement in a prison cell. So when you are in a cell with 4 walls, you start to think very squarely, right? After a few years, you stop having this round 360 kind of attitude to life, to people. You start to have a very square attitude because you lose the ability to communicate with people. You lose so much psychologically year after year that you are, it's very tough to remain sane and humane and compassionate and sympathetic after all these years of being in that sort of space. So for me, the answer to your question is not about the structure of a prison, because I've seen different levels all over the world, and I cite Norway and Cyprus and Brazil to Paraguay, where the conditions are appalling. It's the psychological damage, the psychological that is the toughest. And I think my definitive answer is every prison I've been to is as tough as the next one, because the rule of being in prison is the same. You are confined, you are deprived, you are treated inhumanely, you can't make decisions, a number of different things. So it is torturous wherever you are in the world. It's just some people have stronger minds than others to cope with it.
Yeah, the person kind of feels they lose their sense of liberty, of autonomy, right, Mr. Rowe? It's like it's a really strong feeling, and it's really interesting that you mentioned you start to see the world more squarely, because we really see the world as 360, right? Like this globe, and it's very interesting. You start to see the world more squarely. That's a very interesting point of view. I haven't thought about that. Now that you're describing, Mr. Rowe, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and you can take that one step further and sort of say, when you are thinking severely, things can go around and come back to you. When you're thinking squarely, it just bounces off of the wall. Your thoughts start to become narrower, your behavior becomes narrower. So there are, like you say, there are lots of consequences to that square way of thinking, and you become more selfish. You can become more, there are many things, and some benefit from it, others don't. As I say, my confinement, the trauma I turned into positives, and I used it very, very wisely. And my journey has been very fortunate, and not everybody, 99.9% of people who come out of prison don't have those opportunities to go on and become a success, and make a success of their life.
And in order for us to repeat more successes and more recoveries, what would be your message to people getting out of prison? Like besides, in your case, besides journalism and studying and podcasting, what were the other coping mechanisms, the other escapes you found to heal the psychological trauma and rehabilitate to the world?
That's a really tough question, because we're all different, right? Individually, we all tick differently, and it depends on your support network. Who is your support network in terms of your family, in terms of your work colleagues? If you have an opportunity of coming out and going to work, because not everybody is in prison for 12, 20 years. Some people are just in for short periods as a punishment for something that they did, which was a mistake rather than a crime of inhumanity or anything. So I think, first, it's important to recognize that people coming out of prison have different needs, different requirements, different support networks, different financial circumstances. And so that can have a huge impact on what happens next in their life. So for me, what's really important is what happens when they're in prison, what opportunities, what education, what training, what skills are offered to that individual, so that they can come out of prison with a purpose, with a trajectory of changing their life, and a destiny. And that for me is what's really important. So my message sometimes when I go and talk to prisoners is, what are you doing? I don't put this burden on the authorities. I wouldn't say that it's always for the prison to provide this. It's always for the prison to come up with the answer. Sometimes it's got to come from the individual. So in my case, as I said, I embarked on this journalism course. The prison didn't offer me that. I did it myself by reaching out. So I would encourage people who are in prison first and foremost, but also their relatives, friends, and network outside, to reach into them and sort of say, don't just sit around idly. Try and use that time constructively to build a life for yourself when you come out of prison. Think as hard as you possibly can, discover a new skill, learn something, read, whatever it requires, educate yourself, discover something that you can put to good use when you get out. So for me, it really is about the individual changing their mindset with the support of those who they have around them. And if they don't have that support, that's where the prison need to step in. I mean, they should step in anyway, but the prison can, allocate those resources to try and support those individuals to build better lives for themselves. That's what's really, really important. And parallel to that is within the community. So what are local businesses, local enterprises doing to support those people who are coming out of prison? What opportunities are they offering? It's not good for people to sort of say, oh, they're criminals, they're bad people, they're just going to damage my reputation, steal my belongings, because they inevitably don't. If you give people an opportunity, you put your trust in them, you show them that you're prepared to support them and lead them down a different path. I think if you do it in the right way, they will welcome that. And that's not everybody. There are people dependent on drugs. You've got to get them out of the drug addiction before you can offer that opportunity. People who have mental health issues, and the majority of people who go to prison do have mental health issues or are illiterate, can't read and write, whatever it is. You have to address each individual and signpost people to where they can get that support. That will make a difference.
And talking about this difference of experience, Mr. Rowe, how was Michael Davis's rehabilitation, his time in prison, and you still talk to him today?
So he went on a very different journey to me because of his inability. He had dyslexia. He suffered from, the inability to read and write properly. So his journey of discovery is very different from mine. Since his release, we have had contact on a number of occasions, and that he went down a different path. He became a bus driver. He had a family. He settled down. He is into the music scene as a musician, making music. And he's a taekwondo teacher. So his career and pathway was in a completely different direction to mine. But we do occasionally get in touch, if there are any special annual events, birthdays as you get older, we will meet up then. But we don't, we are no longer friends. We are lifelong friends, but we are no longer the type of friends we were before we went to prison.
Well, that's amazing. Taekwondo, bus driver, music, really eclectic.
It is.
That's amazing.
Very different to what I do.
And Mr. Rowe, and since you mentioned with Michael Davis, you two have families and everything. You're conducting your life. How was the process of starting a family, of marrying and having kids after prison? And how's your relationship with your kids?
Yeah, I think relationships are really difficult because you're deprived of them when you're in prison. So rekindling relationships, developing relationships with people who you then go on to have a family with or to have kids with. For me, it was a very private affair. As a public figure, as a journalist who was out there risking his life to bring stories to the BBC, I spent a lot of my time keeping my private life private. So people were unaware of my private life. They'd already had enough of my public life through the miscarriage of justice and the interest that the media had in me as an individual. So I was very, very careful and very mindful to protect my two children when they were born, and didn't make people aware of them, and didn't up until probably 2 years ago, whereas I wrote my book, Notorious, about my life. And I started to work on television programs where I was more exposed, like Netflix, where people became more aware of me, which meant they were more interested in my back. So when I was at the BBC, people were interested in my investigative work as a journalist, but they weren't interested in me as a public figure. But in the last few years, my kids are old enough now where I think they can appreciate any interest in my profile, but they are old enough to react with understanding. When they're kids, up until the age of 16, they need protecting, as far as I'm concerned, from people being aware of their existence, because at that age they can't make that decision for themselves. And coming from me, it's really important that you don't make decisions for people. But up until 16, then I would have conversation. I mean, my kids, for example, didn't know that I was a wrongfully imprisoned person until they were the age of 12 or 13, because it was only then that I took it upon myself to tell them that I'd been wrongfully imprisoned. And that's because my profile as a journalist had become more prominent in the public, as a celebrity on television shows where my profile had become more, and that was before Netflix, but at the BBC here in the UK, people became more and more aware of the work that I did, and they were questioning my children. So yeah, for me, the important thing was protecting my children, protecting my family from my work and my existence until they were old enough. And now I'm more comfortable because, as I say, 2 or 3 years ago, I published my book, Notorious, where people can read a little bit more about my, life and relationship with my wife and my children, where they can learn a little bit more about my personal life growing up, and my journey through prison. It also comes through on my podcast, where I'm more open to mentioning my family. So yeah, I think the important thing was to protect them until they were old enough to make decisions for themselves.
And coming back to Netflix, how was the process of pitching your show to Netflix and getting in touch with producers and screenwriters and directors? How was the process from the BBC, from journalism to Netflix?
Well, what I did at the BBC is very similar to what I was about to do for Netflix. So I'd made a number of prominent documentaries for the BBC about prisons in the United Kingdom. I was given exclusive access to prisons in the United Kingdom by the British prison system. So I wasn't new to this space, since my release. I had the expertise. People trusted me. I had the credibility to do an honest job, an honest and truthful job that was not sensationalist. And I'd been at the BBC for 16 years, where I'd been a reporter, and I'd become an undercover journalist, and I became an investigative journalist, working on, as I say, some of the most prominent stations. And after 16 years, I needed new challenges. I needed new experiences. So as I was making the decision to change my career, Netflix, which was becoming this new streaming platform that was growing and becoming big and well known, were looking for a presenter, a host for this show to do with prisons. And it was a show that had already been on the UK television broadcasting platform. So Netflix came in and bought that show. They wanted that show, but they wanted a new presenter. I was that new presenter. So the negotiation was pretty straightforward, actually, in that Netflix wanted this Inside the World's Toughest Prisons on their platform. They wanted a new presenter to present it, and I was their first choice. I was the person that they wanted. And so they approached. We had a conversation, the production company and myself, and I only had very simple requests. I should have said to them, £10 million an episode, but that was never going to happen. So I had a very simple request, which is, you've got to allow me to do it the way I want to do it. You've got to allow me to present it within reason, and let me make it as authentic as I possibly can. Of course, as the show goes, there is a formula. I arrive, I go through the process of being integrated into the prison. I meet prisoners. So there is a formula to each episode, as anyone who watches it will know. Every episode has certain points that are similar, the same process, whether it's me being stripped at the beginning and search, or whether it's me being released at the end and summarizing what it is I think about the prison. So it was really a kind of meeting of minds, really, between myself, the production company, and Netflix. And we agreed. We did the first episode, Brazil being the very first one that I filmed in. Brazil, Belize, Ukraine, and I think it was Colombia. It might not have been Colombia in my first episode, but South American prisons were the most challenging, I must admit. Paraguay, Colombia, Brazil, they were the most challenging, not only because of the weather and the heat, which I love, but it's still really difficult to operate. But there's also a language barrier. I don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Portuguese. So I have to have a translator, which is obviously the sound recorder. But the transition from the BBC to Netflix was smooth, is what I would say. What I wasn't prepared for was two things. One was the success of the show. This is a show about life in prisons around the globe. And it became hugely successful for Netflix, but hugely popular for me, where I was becoming more known around the globe. My story, my backstory, like what I'm sharing with you today, became more known to people around the world. And they took an interest in that. They also took an interest in the show. But what really blew me away was how ignorant people around the globe are of their prison system. So, I get messages from thousands of Brazilians who say to me and have said to me over the years that they were unaware that that's what prisons were like in Brazil. That having watched that episode, they didn't know that that's what life was like in Brazilian prisons, and that they appreciate me showing them that side of life, not just here in Brazil, but in other prisons around the globe, so that they can compare and contrast the differences with how governments treat their fellow citizens, and more importantly, the most deprived, challenged, vulnerable people in society are often the ones that end up in prison out of desperation or mental health. So it's been really, really inspiring to me to know that this global audience who watch the Netflix show are interested in what they are seeing and care about the people that they hear from, even though they are criminal.
And Mr. Rowe, and expanding to your podcast, Second Chance, what was your what was the difference from the podcast to Netflix, and how was the process from Netflix to the podcast? How did you expand? How did the idea of the podcast come about?
So, like most people who started a podcast when podcasts became popular, it was during the COVID lockdown period. You know, you couldn't get out there and do your stuff.
That's how they became popular.
Exactly. Well, I found the opportunity to record interview with people over Zoom or whatever, like you and I are doing right now, an easy thing to do. And Second Chance came about because I was having a conversation with a producer, and we were talking about, you know, what we could do, how we could do a podcast, what it was be about. And we just started talking about second chances, people's second chances in life. And it turned to me and my second chance. And I'm sort of saying, I wasn't given a second chance. I took my second chance. I fought hard and long for my freedom. No one gave me a second chance. I took back my life. I fought for my freedom. And so I wanted to expand it to, you know, what does a second chance mean to people? Do you give people a second chance? Do they earn a second chance? And it can mean anything, right? It can be a relationship where your partner cheats on you. Do you give them a second chance if you really love them? Is it too painful? When somebody's been released from prison, do you welcome them back into your family and give them a second chance? If, you know, somebody loses the ability to walk during a car crash, what is their second chance? You know, do they become a Paralympic? You know, so everybody should look at second chances from a different perspective, depending on who the person is. Can a victim of a crime, let's say a rape victim, somebody who's raped, can they give the person who raped them a second chance? Is that a religious decision, a faith decision? Do they think that person deserves a second chance? And who decides who gets a second chance? So I was grappling with these questions. So I thought, ideal, let's call it a second chance, the podcast. So that's what I called it, Second Chance. And I tried to talk to people about their second chances, about the second chances they've given people, the second chance they want. So that was the journey of the podcast, really. And that's how I've tried to shape it. And it's a simple, like this, one-to-one interview with that person where we delve into their lives. And it's interesting because I'm in conversation with the BBC. So I'm a freelance journalist now. I'm not staff for anybody. And I'm talking to the BBC about relaunching the podcast in a different way. So watch this space.
Well, Mr. Rowe, yeah, you created your own second chance, right? You built your path, and that's what's amazing about it.
And now I'm giving other people a second chance or a second purpose or an opportunity to share their story, because and this is really important to say, when I was in the confines of a prison cell, isolated in segregation, and I was shouting and the walls just bounced my words. I was pleading my innocence and screaming for my freedom. I was confined in this square space and no one heard my voice. No one listened to what I had to say. Eventually they did, but there were lots of years when no one heard what I had to say. So second chance for me is also about giving those parents, children, mums, dads, brothers, sisters, victims, perpetrators, an opportunity to have their voice heard in a way that they want it to be heard. They want to tell their story rather than a story someone is telling about them. So that's what I try to do, to give people an opportunity to tell their story rather than somebody tell the story for them.
Well, that's amazing, Mr. Rowe. It's a very noble pursuit, because so many people out there, like, they feel that they don't have their voices heard, and you're opening the space for them. That's amazing, Mr. Rowe. Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. Well, that's one of the things that I do, and as you will know, I set up a charity as well called the Raphael Rowe Foundation, and that
Please, yeah,
was
expand
very
on that,
much.
please, yeah.
The charity was driven by what I witnessed in Portobello. It was driven by what I witnessed in Lesotho, what I witnessed in South Africa, Colombia, Germany. It was driven by the fact that when I went into these prisons and I was coming out of these prisons, I was at times inspired, shocked, disappointed, disheartened. And I just thought that there is more. I have a voice, I have a platform, I have an opportunity to bring some humanity into a space that is often deprived of humanity, the way people are treated. And I'm not just talking about prisoners, I'm talking about people who work in these establishments as well. So I set up the Raphael Rowe Foundation to try and support that mission of trying to bring about the basic human rights that people should be entitled to, whether you're in prison or outside of prison. For me, the work is in prison, but it's about trying to improve conditions, opportunities, infrastructure, all the things that will make people come out of prison and not commit another crime where they leave behind another victim.
And talking about second chances, like new paths, new beginnings, and expanding on the podcast Second Chance, expanding on the Raphael Rowe Foundation, what are the major reforms you believe that the prison systems they need to be more humane? Not talking only about Brazil, England, Colombia. Of course, every country is different, but generally speaking, in your vision, what are the reforms that prison systems need to be more humane and more rehabilitative?
It's a tough one to answer because every prison is different. Every country and culture and resources are different. And that will play a huge part in what rehabilitation means to not just the authorities and the individuals who have committed the crimes, but also the victims and the wider community, right? Because in some countries, they believe in the death penalty. That is the answer to somebody who has committed the most hideous of crimes, which is murder. You take an eye for an eye, you kill people. Is that the answer? And I'm not in a position to say whether it is or it isn't. I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in somebody being executed, but then I've never been in a position where I've been tested to see whether it's something I'd want. I don't think I would. I don't think executing somebody is the answer, state execution, because, if the state have the authority to take somebody's life, who's to say they're not doing that out of other motives? So for me, the key to rehabilitation, the key to changing the humanity in prisons has to start with what the community want. And I don't think I have been anywhere in the world where the community don't want people to be rehabilitated. The key to every prison everywhere in the world starts with rehabilitation. And rehabilitation can mean different things in different countries and have different guises. And it's achievable if they really want to achieve it. And I think a lot of establishments want people to fear prisoners. They want to fear crime because it's a political football, right? They can convince people that whilst there are lots of people that are dangerous, lots of people that they should fear, then they can keep control. And I'm kind of politicizing it, and I'm not trying to politicize it. I'm just sort of saying the resources that go into prison just need to be reallocated. A lot of money in countries around the world are spent on prisons. But for me, they're not spent in the right way. It's not about giving them more money or spending more money. It's about reallocating the money that already exists to try and improve the rehabilitation programs that work for the individual within that establishment or within those prisons. So it's about community supporting the work that non-government organizations, charities like mine are trying to do. If, like I said, the relationship between Brazilian prisoners and the Brazilian staff is zero, then we should do a piece of work that brings them together, because they're the same people. They're both men and women and brothers and sisters, mum and dad. One's committed a crime, the other one's stopping that person from escaping. They're all from the same cloth. It's about bringing them together and getting them to understand. So that would be one piece of work. Important to me And my foundation is about creating opportunities within prisons that can help people upskill, learn new skills, educate themselves, so that they feel empowered, they are held responsible and accountable, and that can make a huge difference.
Excellent, Mr. Rowe. And expanding on your projects, Mr. Rowe, do you have any future projects in mind, and how do you want to keep going on with Netflix and your podcast? Like, what are your what is your idea of the future?
Yeah, my future is different because I have different hats, right? As a journalist, I am continuing to make documentaries. I'm about to go out to Thailand, not Thailand, I'm about to go out to Taiwan next week. Later on this year, I'm going to be in Australia making a documentary about colonization, you know, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, looking at the issue where colonization leads to the imprisonment of people because of their indigenous backgrounds and cultures, and, you know, they're being marginalized. So I'm continuing to make documentaries for different platforms. Inside the world's toughest prisons may or may not continue. I will continue to make films about prisons with whatever broadcasters and platforms from around the world that want to make that with me. I have my own production company to do that. So, you know, if there are any Brazilian broadcasters out there who are interested in working with me on making documentaries, then they should reach out to me. That's important to say. I will hopefully this year be relaunching Second Chance in a different format, same principle, interviews about people's second chances, but I hope with the support of BBC Studios, it will become bigger and better as a platform to give people a voice. And my charity is extremely important to me in terms of trying to get, you know, people to volunteer their time, their expertise, and to raise funds so that we can go into establishments and deliver projects that improve the humanity, the conditions, or the environment for both the prisoners, the people that work in prisons, the staff, and the families that are trying to support those people in prisons, if only so that we can avoid future victims. So, you know, if people are interested, and I should stress this, and I hope you allow this to go out, but if people are interested in getting involved in my charity, they should go to the raphaelrowefoundation.org website, where they can register to support the foundation, whether it's in Brazil or anywhere around the world. And if they want to donate to help me make that work a possibility, and for them to be recognized in helping me do that, I'd welcome that.
Oh, absolutely, Mr. Rowe. And focusing a little bit on your past, Mr. Rowe, before prison, how would you describe in detail, like, your life before prison, as a child, as a teenager, your relationship with your family and your friends? How did the world feel like in Southeast London?
Southeast London, which is a very long, far away place from where you are, I think, in Sao Paulo, which I've only been to the airport. So if there's anyone in Brazil who wants to invite me to Sao Paulo to show me around, don't hesitate to send me a message.
You're welcome anytime, sir.
Thank you. My life in Southeast London was challenging from two perspectives. One perspective was, you know, I grew up in a very deprived sort of social housing environment, just like the favelas, I suppose, in Brazil. Maybe not as deprived, but equally as deprived in a UK London perspective. So, you know, lots of people around me were working class, low income type families, which made for a challenging environment because, you know, people wanted what they couldn't afford, or people couldn't afford the things that they wanted. There was, you know, crime and criminality on a small scale. And I grew up in an environment where I met people that were involved in that, which started to influence my behavior. And so I was involved in petty crime, nothing serious initially, you know, breaking into cars, doing the things that young teenagers do when they try to earn a little bit of money because they're at school, they can't work, and, you know, shoplifting. So And I don't regret doing any of this. I'm not an apologist. I don't stand there and sort of say, I'm sorry that I did this. No, I did it because at the time I wanted a bar of chocolate. So I nicked it from a shop because I couldn't afford to buy it and my parents couldn't afford to pay for it. Yet the shop had so many of them. Why can't I take one? They're not going to lose out and they become multi-billion-pound companies. Didn't think it like that at the time. But at the time, I just wanted a bar of chocolate, so I nicked bars of chocolates, or I broke into cars. I did things that I shouldn't have done, but I don't regret it because at the time, it's what was important to me and the friends that I hung around with. So we were involved in petty crimes, and sometimes that led to, burglaries, breaking into people's homes or into factories and nicking stuff and selling it and making money to pay for the things that we were told we should have, which were advertised. Advertising the latest designer trainers or clothes that you couldn't afford but you wanted. Everybody else is getting them, you think, so you try and nick something to get the money to buy it. So a lot of that criminality that I grew up in was driven by, what we were told we should look like, what we should have. And I'm not saying not everybody falls into that. I did. I was consumed by it, as was my friendship group. And we didn't have jobs, we didn't have parents that could afford it, so we nicked it. And I think that's behind a lot of people's criminality, hence why I understand why some people can desperately end up in prison. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying I understand it. And that inevitably led to me getting into fights because our group of friends got into fights with other group of friends. We were not a gang. I was never in a gang or anything like that. But you go out to nightclubs, you get into fights. I got cut with a knife. I've cut people with a knife in the past. No, not serious, where they've been hospitalized or their life has been threatened. Nothing like that. But street violence has been a part of my growing up, and unemployment was my existence. At home, my parents were law-abiding citizens. There were challenges in my household. My dad is from the Caribbean, Jamaican. He's passed away. My mum is an English British woman. That brought its own challenges because in the United Kingdom, racism was rife when my dad came to this country. So he experienced a lot of racism because of the color of his skin. And where he came from, and lots of white people in those days when he came in the late 50s, early 60s, were still very racist. They still are today. So that brought challenges for him that he brought into our household through drink, alcohol, probably consumed more than he should have. And that could lead to aggressive behavior, whether it was towards me or my extended family. Nothing serious, but enough to create conflict in the household that makes your behavior different to households where working class, middle class people have this civilized sitting around table dinners. So you are a product, is what I'm saying, of your environment and how your parents talk to you, behave towards you. What can they afford to give you? You are, and we all know that. It's not a rocket science. You are a product of your environment. And so my environment wasn't about schooling. It wasn't about universities. It was about survival. And those who were about schooling and university, they had a different expectation. And there's lots of people who didn't like that. But so all I'm saying is that my upbringing in Southeast London was quite typical of lots of households in Southeast London, that they were working class. 99.9% of them went on to do very well working jobs. And that 1%, and I was one of those 1%, committed criminality, got in trouble with the law, ended up in prison or something. For me, unfortunately, I ended up in prison for crimes I didn't commit, whereas a lot of the people that I knew or come from my environment ended up in prison for probably things they did commit, driven by their drug dependency or, their greed for money.
And Mr. Rowe, you think from the 80s the situation changed in Southeast London? Are things better? Are things worse? What do you think?
I think technology brings about education, and I think as technology and infrastructure and things change, more opportunity, jobs, money. Of course, environments change. South East London has changed. When I was arrested and went to prison for crimes I didn't commit, mobile phones didn't exist. The internet didn't exist. When I came out, phones existed. The internet existed. People could expose themselves to other cultures, other environments, the way that other people think. So, the world has expanded in Southeast London as it is anywhere else in the world from the comfort of your bedroom. You don't have to leave your bedroom to explore, I don't know, Sao Paulo. You don't have to leave Southeast London to experience the beautiful beaches of Brazil or the food or the music. It comes to you now. I mean, I would urge people to go and see it for themselves, but that's the reality. And I think when I was growing up in London in the 80s, you weren't exposed to that. You didn't have the money to travel. You didn't have the internet. You didn't have the things that exist today for you to enjoy what other people are enjoying around the world. And that can have a significant impact, I believe, on the behavior of people. I really do believe that. I believe that, people can expand their horizons, their expectations, their languages, everything and anything you want now is there at your fingertips. But in the 80s, and I make it sound it's not that long ago, but in the 80s when I was growing up, in the early 90s, I was in prison for the whole of the 90s. I went in 1988 and came out in 2000. So I didn't see a day of the 1990s, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000. All those years I was in prison. So I don't know what it was like in the 90s. But in the late 80s, people were confined to their own small bubbles.
Yeah, the internet totally reshaped the world, right, Mr. Rowe? It's like a total new historical context, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't just the world, was it? It's individuals. Is what and I know that's what you mean. It reshaped individuals' way of thinking, behaviour, and interactions. Look, I'm sitting in an office in London. You're in where you are in Brazil, and we are having a conversation like we're in the same room with each other. That's the difference. Technology can make that happen. We can share insights and experiences to inform and educate other people, and there's something really beautiful about that.
And Mr. Rowe, like expanding on your books, Notorious and then You Are Accused, how did the idea of writing those two books came about, and how do they differ? Like, what was your main idea with each one of them?
Notorious was very simply something that I wouldn't do for 20 years. So, and when I say that, I mean, when I got out of prison in 2000 and embarked on my journalist career, publishers and book people came to me wanting me to tell my story, write my book, but I refused to do it because I just wanted to enjoy life and do what I was doing. I didn't think that I had much to say. And then when I had my children, that was even more reason not to write my book, because if I was going to write an honest account of my story or some of it, because you can never capture it all, then I would have to share that I had children, and I was not prepared to do that. So Notorious didn't come about until 20 years after I was first asked to write the book, because I had people to protect, family to protect, and other stories to protect. It's one thing writing about your own story, but every time you tell people a story about yourself, you're telling them a story about other people, right? You're including other people, and it's not my place to do that. So Notorious, I eventually wrote because I found myself in a position whereby I felt I was comfortable telling people that I had children. I was comfortable telling people about some of my own personal life that they would have been unaware of. But I was also aware that my profile as a celebrity journalist, presenter, could be of benefit to other journalists, could be of benefit to people who were going through a similar experience to me, but also about just sharing my story, because the general public from around the world wanted to know more about who I was and what I did. And they were sending me messages through Instagram, social media, Twitter, directly asking me about myself. So it's really hard not to want to share. So eventually I decided to write Notorious, which is really a story about where I come from, how I ended up in prison for a crime I didn't commit, what that experience was like whilst I was in prison, and some of the people that I met, notorious gangsters, etc., the Cray twins, how I fought to get out of prison, and then how I became a journalist. and then it stops. It kind of stops there. So there might be a Notorious number 2. So that's how Notorious came about. A simple, straightforward printed book and digital book that people can get through my website or through Amazon or wherever. And You Are Accused came about because the production of my podcast, Second Chance, meant that I was very privileged to speak to people from around the world who talked about being accused of things that they hadn't done, or were accusing people of things that they had done. And this isn't just about crime and criminality. It was just, I spoke to an American guy who talked about being accused of the manslaughter of another man in China, and he ended up in prison. And then they realized it wasn't him and they let him go, and he'd been wrongly accused. He wasn't convicted or sentenced, but he'd been wrongly accused. I met a man in the United Kingdom who was accused of horrific rapes by a woman who had made it all up. And he went to prison. Luckily, he wasn't convicted because she was exposed. And so he shared what it was like to be accused of these horrible crimes of rape and how it impacted his life, etc. I talked to other people about their experiences. Here we have a big story around people being wrongly accused of being involved in things that they were not involved in, but equally people from around the globe. So I thought I'd write a digital book which is available called You Are Accused. What's it like? What's the wider impact that being accused can have? I remember when my son was young, and he was probably about 13 years old. And I can't remember what it was. Maybe something had gone out of the fridge, a bar of chocolate that was mine. And I remember sort of saying, "Who took my chocolate?" And he sort of said, "It wasn't me." And I said, "Yes, it was." And he said, "Well, it wasn't. And you know what it's like to be accused of something you haven't done." He said it in a joke and we laughed about it. But it just resonates, doesn't it? The impact of being accused for something you haven't done, whether it's a crime, whether it's cheating on your partner, whether it's going somewhere that you said you didn't go, whether it's spending money that you don't have, whatever it is, when you're accused, it has a ripple effect and a consequence for lots of different people. Because if your partner's accusing you and you're saying, "But I didn't do it," their family believe you did do it. And the ripple effect is what's really important. How does it impact on the wider community or the wider family? So being accused by a criminal justice system, being accused by your employers, being accused by your partner, being accused can be a really impactful. You can lose your job, you can lose your reputation, you can lose so many things when you're accused of something that is or may not be true. And then it's also about what resources you have. People who are very wealthy who are being accused of something can buy the right legal team to make it go away. People who are poor can't and will end up in prison. So I was really trying to explore the consequences of the ripple effect of being accused.
Has a huge impact on our mental health, right? How will the world perceive us, right? I imagine it's really, really tough, right, Mr. Rowe?
Yeah, and people, it's easy to accuse people. It's hard to prove that that's not true.
Exactly.
I can accuse you right now of swearing. Now, because this is being recorded, you could prove to me that you didn't swear throughout the whole of this interview. But the damage is done, right? I've said it. And anybody who doesn't watch this interview, who just hears me say it, may believe it to be true.
It's open for interpretation.
But but it's more than interpretation, isn't it? Because if you say to me right now, you are a bad journalist, and then you tell people across Brazil that I'm a bad journalist, unless they come to this interview and listen to our conversation where you didn't say that, they wouldn't know whether it's true or not. So all I'm saying is that people can make accusations and spread that accusation that is not necessarily true. And unless you have the evidence to prove it's not true, there is no way of proving it. And the damage is done and there's nothing you can do to repair it, whether it's true or not.
And expanding on that concept, Mr. Rowe, and with all your studies in law, that you study the law and everything to defend yourself, how would you say, how would the justice system, how should the justice system be reformed so that these false accusations don't keep going on. So like we can reduce these false accusations and we have a system more based in hard, concrete evidence and not just accusations, like what happened with you, Mr. Rowe.
It's a really difficult one, isn't it? For me, it does one element, and I can only talk about one element that I think is really important. It's about equality of arms, right? And they talk about that in sort of legal terms. Equality of arms means that the person being accused as well as the accuser have equal access to the evidence. You know, whereas in most countries around the globe, the prosecution, the police, the authorities have all the power, all the access to all the information. But the person trying to defend themselves, their family, their defense team, don't have that information. They don't have the means to acquire that evidence. So they rely very much on the prosecution and the police providing that information. Now, if they want to hide the truth and just present the misleading facts that support their allegations. So it's about equality of arms first and foremost, that both sides should have equal access to information. And in this country, in the United Kingdom, the disclosure of information, evidence is not equal. You know, the defense do not have a fair opportunity to defend themselves. They don't have the investigative powers to carry out investigations. So that's one issue. The second is about advocacy, right? When two people are making an argument, often the intelligent, smart, articulate person is listened to, especially here in the United Kingdom and people that speak English in particular. When somebody speaks with the eloquence of a English person with an accent where they use the right words, your English is exceptional, right? And if you were making an argument, you could make your argument probably better than some of your fellow Brazilians who speak English, but maybe not as eloquent and as clever as you, because they don't have the terminology, the word library or dictionary that you probably use. So what I'm saying is advocacy is really important in the world of justice and criminal justice, because a prosecutor is so skilled at convincing a jury in a case that 3 black men are guilty of a crime committed by 2 white men and 1 black man, because that's what happened in my case. They were very skilled at convincing them by the words, the power of their words and how they articulate it, because they were educated and are intelligent and smart. Whereas the person who stands there swearing and shouting, people dismiss because they're aggressive, they're nasty, but that doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth. So for me, it is about disclosure, access to the evidence equally, and about advocacy. If you're going to try and defend yourself, you need to have the skills that the prosecutor does. And in most places around the world, that doesn't happen.
And Mr. Rowe, well, wonderful interview. We're almost getting to the end here. Let me see if I missed anything, but as always, amazing interview, Mr. Rowe. Thank you so much for your time. Let me see if we missed anything, but I would just say, just for like a little bit more just detail on the past, Mr. Rowe, would you like to describe us like what exactly was the M25 case, and what exactly linked the M25 case with you back in 1988?
So it's important to say that the M25 is a motorway. So it's a highway in the United Kingdom that cars travel on, right? So the M25 is a motorway. It's one of our important roads that gets you in and out of London to travel across the United Kingdom. And the crimes that I was charged with were committed in and around the M25 motorway. So the robbers moved around that motorway and committed crimes against very wealthy families. So the people that lived in the areas where these crimes were committed lived just outside of the M25, which are the affluent, wealthier areas of London. And so the newspapers, the national media broadcasters, called the robbers the M25 gang. Good headline, sensational headline. So the hunt for the M25 robbers or the M25 gang is where that title came from.
The M25 gang was just a way of describing the criminals that the police were looking for. What linked me to the M25 crimes were witnesses who were involved in the disposal of cars that were taken from some of these robberies. And some of the property that was taken from some of these robberies were found in the house of people that lived in the same house that I did. People that I knew, but they were not necessarily friends of me. And when the police discovered that, they arrested everybody at the same time from this house. And then they started questioning all these suspects. And then they started pointing fingers at these suspects. And it just so happens that I was one of those suspects. And because I was saying to the police, I know nothing about this, I was not involved in this, with confidence, because I knew I hadn't been involved, it wasn't enough, because other people who were also being interrogated by the police were saying that they didn't do it, but other people did it. And they started pointing the finger at myself and other people. And the police wanted that because this was a high profile case that was on the front pages of all the newspapers because it involved wealthy people. It was a high profile case where the politicians were demanding that the criminals be caught and brought to justice. So when I was arrested, the police were under a huge amount of pressure to ensure that convictions were secured. And I was a little brown boy with dreadlocks who came from an inner city private estate, social estate, who had no power, no influence, no friends, no lawyers. And so we were easy targets. And we were also black boys. And when you paint the picture of young, sterile, social, it's an easy picture to paint. These are not good kids because they'd been in trouble with the police before. They were involved in petty criminality. It was easy to, whether there was evidence or not evidence, it was easy to put us in the picture, especially when they had other people who were saying, yeah, they did this and they did that, because that's what the police wanted them to say, knowing that they would get a huge amount of money from the reward from it. So that's what the M25 really came down to. So the hunt for the M25 gang was all about the portrayal by the media in this case.
And Mr. Rowe, was there anyone in prison that inspired you to pursue journalism, to defend yourself? Were there people that you met that really inspired you to take a different trajectory in your life?
Absolutely. There were a number of high-profile people in prison who themselves were miscarriage of justice victims. Eventually, their convictions were overturned. They were released. In particular, there was notorious IRA individuals, so people that had been accused of being involved in the Irish Republican Army, a political group in Ireland that was fighting against the British authorities. And a number of people had been accused of being involved in bombings and other atrocities, whereby they were sent to prison. And it turns out that they were not responsible, that they'd been fitted up. And I met a number of these types of people when I was in prison, and they'd been through what I'd been through, i.e. they had fought the system physically and suffered. So they'd been where I was starting. And it was some of these people who said to me, you are never going to fight your wrongful conviction by just throwing your fist at people and being beaten up and put in isolation. You need to find the power in your words, in getting the newspapers to campaign on your behalf and getting people outside to support you, because that's what they were doing. And they were getting a lot of attention from the media, and there were news stories. So yeah, it was a lot of people like that I met who'd been where I was starting and were successful in getting their convictions overturned. So they helped me see things differently, think about things differently, and do things differently.
Mr. Rowe, wonderful interview. Thank you so much for your time. And it was more than an honor to interview someone like you, truly an epic hero who's been through several trials and tribulations and is bringing us knowledge about the prison systems, how they can be more humane, and it's truly giving people voice. And thank you so much, and congratulations for all your noble work that you do globally. Thank you so much. And before we finish, Mr. Rowe, is there anything else that you want to add, comment?
Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I have a lot of support from people in Brazil. I think that's evident in the messages that I get. I'd love people to reach out to me after they've watched this on Instagram to share their thoughts, feelings. I'd like people to reach out to me if they feel they can help with the charity work that I'm doing. And even if they just take an interest in wanting to be kept up to date with what I'm doing so that they feel that they are a part of something. And if people want to listen to my podcast, and all that stuff is really good and really important for me and the work that I do. And I don't do these interviews very often these days, you know, so I just want to take this opportunity to thank your listeners for tuning in and listening, but also to thank that Brazilian population that are interested in this space, care about this space, and have found this interview interesting. And yeah, obrigado.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Rowe.